Welcome to TNT Episode 19, Bible Translations.
Well, we're glad you're here with us again this week, and we're going to have to talk louder today because you're going to possibly hear some background noise. It's actually getting warm here.
Yay!
Yay, finally! And therefore
Like
you're going to hear noises like that.
If you didn't hear anything, just humor us. We're not crazy. There was a
Well, we heard stuff.
We heard stuff.
you
We're
heard-
hearing stuff.
But we usually do.
Yeah.
But that's another thing. But anyway,
That's for
we're going to have the window open, fan on during this whole episode, and hopefully it's not too distracting, because we have another important and controversial topic, the topic of Bible translations, asking today, which American English translation should a Christian use? Now, this is assuming, of course, that the Christian we're referring to is American
And speaks English.
and speaks English, because if you're from another country, it's probably better to get a language version that applies more to you.
The reason we're saying American English is if you've seen our Bill Nye Ken Ham debate video, which
We're referencing back to that.
right, I'll post a link to that at the end of the video. You can see it if you want. But
Yeah.
Bill Nye several times during the debate pointed out that Ken Ham didn't know what he was talking about because he was basing his facts on an American English translation of the Bible, which that's completely ridiculous. But that's been an in-joke a little bit now over the course of our videos,
So
referencing
we like to reference American English,
right,
yeah.
as some kind of a out there, really odd translation that weird people that nobody knows about uses. So, but we're here to actually tell you about real American English, not even always American, but more or less American English translations, and good ones that you can use.
Well, you may have noticed when you go to the store, if you're at a bookstore maybe, or you're out shopping for Bibles on the internet, that there are a lot of different kinds of Bibles. And if you're new to looking for Bibles, or maybe you've been a Christian for a long time and you just don't know, well, which Bible should I choose? We want to talk about that today, explain a little bit about Bible translations, and help you with choosing a Bible that would be good for you. So there are different questions you need to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Some things we're going to get you to think about as you choose a translation. But what you need to realize off the bat is that all English Bibles, every English Bible out there, whether it's American English, or English, or Australian English, or Chinese actually, or Korean, they're all translations from the original manuscripts, which were actually written in Hebrew and Greek primarily.
Mm-hmm.
So the Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew, the New Testament was written in the language of Greek.
And we have plenty of those manuscripts, like more by huge amounts than almost any other ancient
Piece of
major
literature,
manuscript.
Yeah, I
So-
think like the Homer's Odyssey, there's
Right,
not
the Iliad,
really...
we have so few copies of those, but
Yeah, we're
people
talking
don't-
about
Yeah.
ancient manuscripts, by
Right.
the way. We have lots of modern
Mhm.
translation copies of the Odyssey, but we
Right.
don't have a lot of the old manuscripts. But we have a
Yeah.
lot of the old manuscripts of the Bible.
Until it was discovered that there were people who had continued down the tradition of memorizing the Homeric epics. We didn't even have a full source to go by translating those. We've, for many years, had lots of very complete manuscripts to translate the Bible from, but people still argue that how can we know that the Bible wasn't corrupted at some point, but we can see that it hasn't.
Yeah, and another thing to take into account is that we have a lot of we have some manuscripts that are extremely old. We have a lot of manuscripts that are definitely very old, but some that date back to just maybe the 3rd century or even the 2nd century. There's a little piece of the Book of John. We have an actual snippet, fragment copy of the Book of John that goes back to the 100s. And they've recently found a little snippet of the Book of Mark that they've talked about maybe being dated to the 1st century. That's incredible. So they're finding some really old things, and again they find that the wording, by and large, matches up.
Mm-hmm.
Which for copies that are handwritten copies,
That's
you wouldn't expect.
unheard of.
Yeah, you wouldn't. I mean, you're going to have some differences when you hand copy something. So that's nothing to be alarmed about. The fact that we have so many different manuscripts allows us to compare
Right.
and see what it originally would have been. So all that to say, we're looking at translations, and that gets into what we're going to talk about now, which is translation philosophy. What's the philosophy? What is the approach of the people who are translating this particular translation of the Bible, whatever it is you're looking at? So you'll see a lot of letters on the side of a Bible. Some will say KJV, which stands for King James Version. Some will say NIV, which stands for New International Version. And those are just the different translation names based on different translation committees or people that translated those Bibles.
That
So-
doesn't mean that the source was different,
No.
usually.
No.
It
No.
just means that they took the same stuff and decided that they were going to translate it differently according to what they felt was most important to carry over.
Yeah. So just like if you want to use a more modern example, the book Les Miserables, you can actually get that in different translations. Different people will be on the front cover who translated that particular version because it was originally in French, in case you didn't know that. You can kind of tell by the title. They never translate that.
No, it's too awesome.
It's too awesome. No one would know what the book was if you actually translated it. So anyway, you have different translators of Les Miserables. The question is, what's the best way to translate it? Do you want to have something that's more word for word, like exactly taking the original language and trying to put the same wording in our language? The problem with that is you get some really weird wording. I'll give you an example of that. I have here this is what you would call word for word. I mean, this is like if you just took the Greek
This
and
is
put it
like
in English.
if you Google translated the original Greek into English.
I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you blossomed anew of me, so as to think as to whom indeed you were thinking, but were lacking opportunity. So that's what happens if you just take the words of Greek and just insert them right into English.
Which does work somewhat for English because so much of our language is based off of Greek, but
Yeah.
let's say you were translating it into some Indonesian language. It probably
It wouldn't
wouldn't
work as
even
well.
work that well. So
But the point is that even in English,
even in English,
if
not
you
as-
take it to an extreme, it wouldn't be a very
right.
good
It's not a
translation.
very efficient way to read it.
On the other pendulum side, though, there's what you would call a paraphrase, because on the opposite side of word for word, you have what is called more of a thought for thought translation. And Taylor earlier was reading all different thought for thought translations
Yes,
that.
it was all kinds of stuff from the Aussie translation, the Ebonics translation, to all
Yeah.
kinds of different Pidgin translations, which are actually really awesome. But
In their own way.
right?
They're
Yeah.
taking the original concepts and just putting them into the way you would say it in whatever colloquialism. So an example
Yeah.
of this.
I'd like to read this one.
Oh, you want to read this particular passage? Okay, this is from the Message Remix, which is
It's not just the message.
yeah,
It's more hip than that.
it's even more up to date than the Message. So I don't know, just read like the first
Okay.
section there.
Jeremiah.
See, we really do have the window open.
Jeremiah 3. Your sex and religion obsessions. God's message came to me as follows. If a man's wife walks out on him and marries another man, can he take her back as if nothing has happened? Wouldn't that raise a huge stink in the land? Isn't that what you've done? Hoard your way with God after God? And now you want to come back as if nothing's ever happened? God's decree. So, it's a little bit different than if you read it in the King James Version. Just a little.
Yeah. And actually, if you get the Message Bible, you'll find it to be very easy to understand, but what you've got to understand, it'd be like taking Les Miserables and saying, we just want it to be really, really easy to read. We'll paraphrase it.
It'd be like taking Hamlet and making it the Lion King.
Okay, there you go. Maybe not quite that extreme, but
It
that
can
idea.
be.
That idea.
That's basically the George Romero zombie Bible, so
Yeah. So we
It
have
has been done.
we have a chart here that we'd like to put up for you, and it'll just show you. And if you want to just freeze frame this at some point for reference, maybe we could put a link to this.
yeah, I'll put a link in the description where they can just go to the site this came from, and it's got the information, copyright information in the lower corner. So
Brent McDonald.
yeah,
So this chart was put together to kind of show you On the left side is the word for word, and on the right side is the paraphrase translations, and then everything kind of in between on a continuum. And so you can see right on this chart where the different translations fit. So later we'll get to what we think is really like the best idea for this, but it just gives you an idea that you're either going to go with something that's extremely literal, or something that's an extreme paraphrase, or something that leans one way or the other.
Yeah, you know, there's the Muslim translation philosophy of their Quran where they say there are no translations of the Quran, there's only interpretations, which, to a kind of extreme, that's kind of the case with the Bible. You're not going to understand probably what the exact meaning behind it was unless you can read the original, but...
Yeah.
So,
well,
then it really gets to then which word for word or thought for thought, which is
Yeah.
really the best way to
yeah.
look at it.
And we have to be careful because I think that translations, on one hand we want to recognize it's not the original language, but on the other hand, these translators, there's committees that do this.
Yeah.
Many of these translations are really good.
Considering you can take
Yeah.
the same passage in 5 different translations that each have a bit of a different design philosophy behind it and get the same thing from it.
It kind of
is-
shows you.
Yeah. It's pretty
Now,
impressive.
one of the things that comes up with translation philosophy are how to deal with controversial issues. For example, what we might call gender inclusivity. If Paul says, "Brothers, I urge you," do you translate that brothers when really he's talking to men and women? So you could translate that brothers and sisters, even though the original word is brothers.
Right.
So that's a question. Are you going to be gender inclusive? That's been a very controversial issue with the NIV.
Yeah. You then have to get into that. If you go that far, you're stripping all the culture from
Yeah,
the
depending
passage.
on how extreme you
so
take that.
it
Yeah.
can kind of sanitize it and help you forget the surrounding context of what it is you're reading, and that can be a problem.
Yes, but that is something, and again, these things can be extreme. So, like, it's one thing to say, we're going to translate it brothers and sisters. It's another thing when you start saying, well, we're not even going to refer to God as him.
Yeah.
We're going to refer to God in a gender-neutral manner to
There's
not...
translations that call God him or her, or
Yeah.
him and her.
Right.
It's crazy. Some that just say her.
But that's one translation philosophy, is to try to say we're not going to give God a particular gender reference.
So you don't want to offend me.
Another controversial issue is difficult words that maybe carry cultural connotations that are tough. And a good example of this is the word in the New Testament, slave. The King James translators didn't translate it slave, they translated it servant, which is interesting. The New King James translators translated it bondservant, so it has a little bit more of a connotation of slave. But some of the new translations are actually starting to say, let's make it more literal and translate it slave. But that's
And
controversial.
Even then, the definition of slave in Greek culture wasn't exactly what it was in England when they translated. So it was maybe even a little closer to the term bondservant than it was to slave. So that it's just
possibly it's how you look at it.
Right.
But obviously a slave is
it's
a
a
slave.
big issue.
And you
So
can see why that's hard for
very little
translators.
details.
Another word might be a word like baptize, which more literally would just mean to immerse, to dip someone.
Baptize isn't an English word.
Right. It's just taken from a Greek word and put into English, because baptize over the years in Christianity ended up being done in different ways other than just immersing.
Right.
So again, that's a potentially controversial term that you have to translate. Or how about the name for God? Do you go with a very common term for God's name in the Old Testament that we use in translations is Lord. It's all capitals, Lord, but it actually stands for I think it's called a tetragram, YHWH, which basically you could use the term Yahweh, and that is how some translations translate it. Others have retained the traditional Lord. So,
Which then you're trading cultural connotations, because at this point it is a part of. That's how we.
Yeah, that's how we've come to talk about
so,
it. Right.
To us, there's probably not necessarily a problem with
Right.
rendering it.
But you will see in some translations Yahweh, and it used to be Jehovah. That's actually from the same thing. But we won't get into that now.
That's for another episode.
That's for if you have follow-up questions you want to send us on email. We'll talk with you more about this. Now, another thing you want to look at, aside from translation philosophy, is understandability. Where are you at as a reader? Let's say you're a third grader. We know we have a lot of third graders watching this video right now.
Of course.
Hi to
They
all you
probably
third
make
graders.
up all of our audience almost.
We're kind of
They'll have
at
to drag
that,
their parents
that
into
level in our humor. But if you're a third grader, it might be hard for you to read some of the translations that are at a higher level. So there are
Interestingly,
Bibles.
I've
Yep.
read several long arguments as to why the King James Version is the easiest to understand translation out there, using magical computer software that shows that the sentence structure is incredibly simple, so even a second grader should be able to understand it. Completely ignoring the words themselves, the sentence structure is simple enough so that it is the easiest to understand translation in the world, apparently.
Well, hey, if a computer says it, it's got to be true.
It doesn't matter if humans say it.
I actually did grow up reading the King James
that's
Version.
a large part of it.
But I will
Sure.
say, even having grown up read it, I'm used to it. I can do it. But those who haven't grown up with it,
I didn't
and
grow up with it.
you didn't
so
grow up with it.
It
Aw.
is not
foreign to you.
It is not really, really hard to understand, but I would not use it for studying.
Okay.
It is.
What would you
not
use
worth-
it for?
I would use it for going, wow, look how they talk back then.
So we're sorry if we're offending those of you who love the King James. Actually, I really think the King James sets a very high bar for
Yeah.
Bible translation. It's beautifully written language, and I still like it.
greatly influenced the English
It
language.
did, and I actually personally many times use the New King James Version because it retains a lot of that literary
And
quality.
That's what I grew up with.
But that's a side issue.
That's a side
What we're trying to say is if you're a young person or if you're not really good at reading, you might want to find an easier to read thought for thought translation. Now, if
Not
you're
the message.
no, that's a paraphrase. The New Living Translation would be a good example of a good thought for thought translation. Your reading level is another issue. Maybe not your age, but just where you're at in your reading level. But I will say one more thing about this. It's always good to try to read things that maybe are a little hard for you.
You push
Because-
yourself
yeah.
higher and higher.
Exactly. So that's something else to consider. But don't jump into the deep end. If you're not ready to read the King James Version, it's not like that's the only thing you can read. It's okay to pick up a New Living Translation or an NIV, New International Version, if that's easier for you to understand. The important thing is that you actually understand what you're reading. But we'll get to later which translations we really recommend to the majority of our audience. Because we know that everybody watching this show probably has a super high reading level.
Of course.
Yeah,
That's why they're watching videos on YouTube.
exactly. Exactly, because they're always reading. So let's give some examples of everything that we've talked about now. Let's talk about the King James Version.
Okay.
All right. Now, would you like to actually read this again? Would you, now that since you did the message, maybe you could read the King James?
I'll read the King James Version.
Ah.
Let's do the same passage. Is it Jeremiah 3?
Well, actually, I wanted to read my favorite passage
Oh,
from the
okay.
King James.
I'll do that.
So go ahead.
1 Corinthians 16:13.
That's not 1 Corinthians 16.
It is not.
Let's start
Okay,
that over.
okay.
It's Romans 7.
Uh-huh. Romans 7:15. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that I not. That do I can't even say it. That do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. And you wonder why they have to come up with long arguments to try to convince people that it's easy
just
to
like the
understand.
computer program said, that is easy enough.
It is very easy sentence structure. It's just, it might pass as
Except
bad
for the
grammar.
words.
It might pass as bad grammar if you ask somebody who's studied English, but it's easy to understand if you don't know English grammar.
Now that translation, actually, we picked an extreme example.
Yeah, that's I don't-
there are a lot of verses that are a lot easier to understand and a lot more beautifully put passages. But on the other side of that, that translation has lasted for a good 400 years now, because it was originally translated in 1611. 400 years that translation has been around and is continuing to be used. Whereas now we're going to the other extreme, and we're trying to make translations for every person under the sun.
I mean, there's a was it the remix of the message?
Yeah, the
That's-
message remix. And
Like
how
they
about-
had to update that how soon after it came out? Like a couple years maybe.
yeah. And how about this one? We got the. This is the
It's
New
the
Century Version, and it's a New Testament, and it's actually one of Taylor's favorites.
I have heard many things about this,
Yeah.
but until now I've never gotten a chance to actually see it for myself. It's just
Yeah.
as horrifying as I was led to believe.
Well, it's basically in magazine format. Now, I've shown
Very
this
thick
to
magazine.
people to kind of say it's actually not really the best thing in the world to do with the Bible, and yet when people see it, they're like, "Oh, I'd love to get one of those." But it's like it's got a blab section on the right here, you know. I don't know.
Well then.
So, and then like all different articles that pertain to teenagers, and
Teenage girls, that is.
yeah, teenage girls. Teenage guys might be interested in seeing this, but
It's definitely interesting, I'll say that.
no doubt about it. And this is actually, I think they update this regularly to keep it up to date. But that's one example of how they're kind of making Bibles now that cater to every single person under the sun. They have the Hunter's Bible and the Golfer's Bible and the.
They have the I don't know what the real
Do they
name
have the
of it is.
Computer Nerd Bible?
They probably do.
It's all in binary code.
I'm positive you can get a binary Bible.
Oh,
Absolutely positive.
neat.
But I don't know what the actual name of it is, but there's a like Mother Earth Bible where all instead of having the words of Jesus in red, all the verses about taking care of the earth are in green.
There
I
you
don't know what
go.
the actual translation of it is, but it's the presentation.
Well, exactly, and that's another thing is there's a lot of different packaging versions of the Bible, and it's not necessarily the translation that's different.
Right.
All that to say, though, that this is examples of where translation has gone today. We also want to do something else here and read for you 1 Corinthians 16:13 in a few different translations, just so you get a taste of how they deal with one particular phrase. So I'm going to read to you, and Taylor's going to read to you 1 Corinthians 16:13 in a few different translations, and you'll hear the difference. And it has to do with one particular phrase that I like, and it's in the original. It basically tells the Christians. Paul says to them, "Be men," which is another way of saying act courageous. But he says in the original Greek, "Be men." So how do you translate that is the question. So I'll read some. You can read some too. Just
Okay.
pick some out
Are we
here.
gonna say the name of each translation? Or
Yeah.
we're just gonna run through. Okay.
We'll actually give the translation so you can hear what they
All
did
right.
with it, but we won't do them all because there's like way too many. But the King James actually originally said, "Quit yourselves like men," which means acquit yourself or equip yourself like men. But again,
And
confusing.
then the KJ21, which I'm not familiar with, but
That's just a little update to the King
Aha.
James.
this says, "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, acquit yourselves like men, be strong." So they actually did say acquit.
Yeah, but the original King James
It
is
just
quit.
said
Quit like men. Well, yeah. I like the. This is a kind of a Jewish version of the Bible. It's still English, but it kind of has a Jewish twist to it. It says, "Stay alert, stand firm in the faith, behave like a minch, grow strong." I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but I guess it's basically saying act like a man.
The DRA, another one I'm not familiar
It's
with.
like the Dwayne Rhymes version, and it's a pretty old translation.
Says, "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, do manfully, and be strengthened."
Okay. Now, it's interesting. The English Standard Version is getting to be very popular. So I'm
That's
going to
the
read that
I
one.
use.
And then I think we should also read the NIV,
Mhm.
and that could be our last one. But the English Standard Version says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." So you can see that's a pretty literal rendering
Yeah.
of that verse.
It's a literal rendering of it in phraseology that we do use in modern English.
Yes.
We do say, "act like a man" in English, so it's the same
Possibly.
thought.
But it can also be offensive to
It
people.
can, but
Yeah, and
It's
I
still a
can
term
tell you
that
that
was-
the New King James, which is interesting because it's actually trying to be like the King James, doesn't say anything about being men. It just says be courageous, something like that. But go ahead and read the NIV.
NIV, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong.
So there you go. There's another translation that just says, instead of act like men.
Right. Which then you get the less offensive meaning of it, but then you lose the
literal nature.
You lose the literal nature, you lose the cultural connotation.
Yeah. So the real question is, how much do you want to go with something that reflects the culture of their day, or how much do you want to go with something that's really easy to understand in our world? And so these are things you have to weigh. But let's just close off now this whole show that we've done by looking at our recommendations for translations. And if Taylor has a favorite one of his, he can say it.
Yeah. The first right off, I know there's a couple. In case you use an iOS device, I'm sure it's on Android OS also. But there's several different apps that you can get that let you read the Bible. And I personally like the YouVersion the best. It's
absolutely
free. It's got a lot of ton of versions on it. You can download
and I
them.
use Android. I know they have it for Android. Just to verify
awesome.
That.
You can. A lot of translations you're able to listen to it. I haven't actually tried that out, but they've got Bible reading plans. There's notes that people can add, and you can look at. You can highlight, make your own plans.
Yep.
I've tried a couple of other versions, and I know the YouVersion one is the most common, so there's people who look at it.
Now, just so you know, the YouVersion is not a translation.
Right.
It's just an app that gives you access to many different translations.
There's other apps that will make you pay for certain versions, or you can only read it online, or this or that, but I think we both found that YouVersion's a pretty good app.
Absolutely, and I have some specific translations I'd like to recommend.
Mm-hmm.
So one is the New King James Version.
Mm-hmm. That's what I grew up on, although it's not my favorite, but that's what I grew up on.
It's really good, especially if you know the King James Version, you like the King James Version. It's a good update to the King James. It uses a little bit more modern findings and scholarship in its translation, and updates the wording more so you're not getting into some of that weird wording that we talked about earlier. But it still has a lot of the flow and beauty, and also the same textual basis as the King James Version. Another one that I really like is the English Standard Version. This is
what I use.
Yes. And this is actually the ESV Study Bible, which has study notes too, and that's really good.
Mm-hmm.
And so this I highly recommend.
And I don't personally have a huge reason for why that's the one I like. I just like its wording. I like the flow of the sentences as compared to the NIV and the NKJV. I'm not going to say it's better. I'm just going to say I prefer it over a couple of the others.
Well, it's interesting. The King James Version, as we talked about, was translated 400 years ago. If you actually look at kind of a stream of translations, certain ones kind of flow from the King James. They're kind of updates. And the English Standard Version is basically a down-the-line update of the King James Version. But it's more in our English, and as well as the New King James. They're both that way. Here's one I'm going to recommend, though, that, like the NIV, is not even in the stream of King James translations. This is just a totally fresh translation, and it's called the Holman Christian Standard Bible.
And I've never even read that translation.
You've never even read it. But I believe if you read this translation, especially if you're new to the Bible, you'll find it understandable. But I would say it's less thought for thought than the New International Version. It's more literal, but still put very much in ways that relate to how we speak today. So it's a good translation from my perspective. It gets that balance of what we've talked about today. It's not too literal, but it definitely tries to retain more of the cultural things that you read in the Bible, rather than just being straight thought for
Which
thought.
I personally like. I like to be able to be reminded of the context of stuff as we went along. And of course, study Bibles are great for that. No matter what the translation, you're going to get notes along the way if it's a good study.
Yeah, if it's a good study Bible. And we could talk about study Bibles some other time, but we've definitely covered the topic of Bible translations, maybe even more thoroughly than you wish we would. Hopefully we've actually helped you and not just confused you. But if you have questions and follow-up to this, you want to know more about this, please email us. Let us know if there's any way we can help you out with this, or if you have any opinions you'd like to share that you'd like us to maybe talk about and deal with on one of our upcoming episodes.
Just remember, justifications for the King James Version must be kept to 5,000 words or less.
Yes, and again, we didn't mean to offend any
No, of
King
course
James
not.
users, but we hope that this has helped you in choosing a Bible translation. The most important thing, though, is that you do pick up a Bible, whatever one you get, and read it and learn from it. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you'll tell others about our show.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe, spread the word, and see you next time.